I want to share with you what I have learned in this field for almost 30 years working in this profession. I started my journey in special education way back in 1990 when I joined bachelor's degree in mental retardation program in NIMH. I see Dr. Patnaik is joining. She was my faculty member at NIMH who did teach me at that time. So I'm quite pleased to be here with my former faculty member as well. So question is often asked, why inclusion? I will spend very little time about talking about why inclusion, because there is a 40 years of research in the field of inclusive education that clearly shows the benefits of inclusion. There are academic benefits and there are social benefits. Oftentimes for some parents, social benefits of inclusion kind of outweighs the academic benefits for their children. So there is a strong body of literature that shows that when students with disabilities are placed in general education environment with their peers without disabilities, the outcomes are far greater than they would be attending a self-contained classroom or a segregated setting or a special education classroom. The reasons being they have role models, their peers without disabilities, and often learning takes place in a social environment. Think of our own learning. We learn by observing others. Often I have learned many behaviors living in different parts of the world, including Australia, Japan, and in the United States, by simply observing people. So that's how primarily at the very basic level learning takes place. So again, inclusion has been shown to bring both academic as well as social benefits for students with disabilities. And in today's conversation, I will focus on some of the challenges that our students with disabilities have and how we can meet those challenges in inclusive environment. And I will talk about accommodations, different types of accommodations that can be provided to meet the needs of these students in general education or mainstream classroom. And I will speak about some high leverage practices. These practices are informed by research. We ought to be using those practices or strategies or techniques that have been proven by research. So as much as possible, we should be using those in our classrooms. So that's how I will frame my conversation. We will discuss their strengths and challenges that they have, some accommodations, and then we will talk about some high leverage practices. So this slide, you see planning for inclusive education. When we have students with disabilities in our mainstream or general education classrooms, how should we plan? These are three things we should keep in mind when we plan our instruction. First and foremost, I focus on my students' strengths. Our students have many challenges, but I, as their classroom teacher, I want to focus on what they are good at, what their talents are. In fact, when I was teaching in Delhi, I did have one visually impaired student who was extremely talented with musical skills. She would bring her synthesizer to our classroom and she would show, you give her any song to play, she would start playing that so beautifully. You know, I was amazed. I am very little musically talented, if you will. I have very little um, uh, talent, or any skill in that area. But my student, who was in fifth grade at that time, she was highly talented in musical skills. I have had other students with disabilities when I taught them for 11 years in K-12 classrooms. Some of them were highly verbal. They could not write well, but when I asked the concept to explain, they were able to answer those orally. So I, as a classroom teacher, I found out what their strengths were, and then I focused on what they were good at. So in special education, as much as we want to acknowledge the challenges that our students have, the first and foremost, we should focus on our students' strength, what they are good at. Are they good at working with their peers, working with students in the classroom? Are they do they have strengths in technology? Some of our students, they are very talented in using technology. Some of my students, they have shown me how to operate some of the apps that I have, or how to manage computer programs. So as their classroom teacher, I want to recognize, I want to understand what their strengths are. And before they come to us, we can find out from their parents, because often parents, they are a great source of information that we do not see in the classroom. We can also ask other teachers in which class our students go to, because some of the behaviors that we see in our classroom, they may not be seen in the other classroom, and vice versa. So those are your good sources of information. You also may ask students themselves, what they are good at, and they will tell you, hey, I'm good in using technology. I work really well with computers. If they have difficulty with writing and they are able to type up their response, excellent, use that. In this day and age when cell phone is prevalent, if they can record their response to the question or the essay that you have given as an assessment, accept that not everyone has strengths in all areas. Think about yourself. Some of you may be a good writer, some of you may be a good speaker, some of you may have other talents. So I want you to pay attention to strengths of our students, and I'm sure you do when you work with these students. Second point that I want to make here is focus on their interests. What are their unique interests, and why am I saying that we should focus on their interest? Because when we know what their interests are, we can engage them in the classroom instruction meaningfully. When I was teaching a student with autism, when I was in Tokyo, Japan, I had an international student from Australia. He was in my classroom, and he had very specific interest about trains. Tokyo has a really large network of subway system. And I would ask the student, Louis, tell me, how would I go from one station to another? And I purposely would make it really complicated, that one would have to change a couple of trains to get to the next station. And Louis, he will immediately tell me, you take this particular train, get off at this station, then take another train, get off the next station, then take another train, and then you will reach your final destination. Because Louis was very interested in trains. Anytime you talk about trains, he would be naturally inclined to join in the conversation. I see that in my own boys. I have two high school age kids at home. I have a ninth grade. My younger one is in ninth grade, and the older one is in 10th grade. They take great interest in basketball. So when I talk to them about basketball, they are interested, they want to talk to me. Other times they are not that interested. Their conversation topics are different from mine. So my point is, find out, what they are interested in. Some of our students, they are interested in using their hands to work. They kind of like to manipulate. They like to hold things, right? You try to teach them, you give a lecture, and then after 20 or 30 minutes, you can see the class, they are kind of bored. You can tell by their facial expression. So as much as possible, incorporate their interests into your instruction. And how do we know what their interests are? Before the beginning of the semester, or before the beginning of the school year, when they come to you, implement an interest inventory. There are many interest inventories out there. You can look up online, or you can do an informal question and answer. Tell me, some of you, what are you interested in? Sports being one key area. I'm sure students in India, they are interested in cricket, right? So when you are teaching, for example, a math concept, if you incorporate those, how many runs, say for example, who is the captain? Virat Kohli, I think he is the captain now. I'm not following cricket for some time, so I apologize. Or Dhoni, how many runs they made against a team on a particular match. So those kinds of things will generate interest among your students, and they will be naturally engaged in your instruction. And finally, you definitely need to understand what their needs are. And I will briefly speak about understanding their needs on my next slide. We really want to understand what are some challenges that they are having. So let's go on to the next slide. It does say in the center, learning disabilities, but I want to use a general term, students with disabilities. So that should be in the center. And look around it. Those are the areas that our students with disabilities, they have challenges with. And as their classroom teacher, you really want to understand where they are in terms of their reading. There are some students that I have worked with. There was one high school 9th grade student. He had decoding challenges. He had really difficult time decoding. That means he had much difficulty with reading fluency. His comprehension was great. He would, if I played a tape recorder, if there was something that he listened to, his comprehension was fantastic. But when he was trying to read and comprehend, he was putting all of his energy decoding, trying to read what it was, and that impacted his comprehension. So as a teacher, I understood that that is a challenge for my student, and I used assistive technology. I used Kurzweil software. So instead of him reading, I uploaded the document in the software and it read to him. And when that happened, his comprehension, obviously he was good at, so that did not present a challenge to him. So reading is a challenge. Math, those of you who teach math to your students, you will find that our students have difficulty with math word problems. In terms of processing information in math, math problem solving fluency, how quickly they solve, that is a challenge. The other challenge that I wrote under academics is writing. This is one area that I have seen many students with disabilities and without disabilities, they have difficulties with. Some of the common challenges that I have seen is how to start. When you give them a writing prompt or a writing topic, they would struggle how to start. So how can we help them? Maybe give them a sentence starter that will get them started. Some of them, they have ideas in their head, but when they are trying to write, their ideas are all over in their essay. For example, something that should be at the end in their conclusion section of the essay, that's kind of showing up in the middle, or vice versa. So those are some challenges, and we are not even discussing difficulty with writing, holding pencils or pen. Our students who have spasticity, physical difficulties, they have those obvious difficulties. But again, learning disabilities or invisible disability, that it is often called, they have these challenges. And in the United States, in general education classroom, half of the population of disabilities do have learning disabilities. That means they have difficulties in reading, writing, or math in one of those areas or all of those areas. And this slide shows how learning disabilities, how it manifests and how it impacts students' learning in different areas. I will pick a couple. I'm aware of the time that has been given to me, so I won't go through all of these. I will go over. The other one is memory. As those of you who work with students with intellectual disabilities in particular, you probably find that our students have difficulties with both short-term as well as long-term difficulties. And I'll just give you one example. In my 9th grade math classroom, I had a student with autism. He used to do really well on quizzes. For example, I taught a concept today, and I gave him a quiz right after I taught, and he did really well. And I was quite pleased the progress that he was making. But when I gave him a test that was a chapter, maybe I taught for about 2 weeks, and then I gave him a unit test that comprised of the concepts that was covered in all of those mini sections of that unit, and he did really poorly on the unit test. I question myself, why is that happening? He is doing well on quizzes, but when it comes to the test, he is not doing well. And before I gave him the next test, next major test, I took him outside the classroom and spent some time, about 5 to 7 minutes, in the hallway. I just sat in the hallway for a few minutes, and I quickly reviewed the key concepts from that unit. And then I brought him back to the classroom with all his peers, and I gave him the test, and he did really well again. So that tells me that our students have difficulties with either short-term and long-term memory difficulties that they have. And we want to think of what strategies or what techniques we can use to help them with the challenges that they have. One other area that I will address here, or I will cover on this PowerPoint, is difficulties in metacognition. This is one major area that I find our students with disabilities have difficulties with. As you know, metacognition, or the other term for metacognition, is called executive functioning. Those of you who work with students with learning disabilities, you know this term really well. It's basically about monitoring your own thoughts. Am I learning? For example, if I'm reading a book and my objective is to understand what is that book addressing. So as I'm reading, for example, I have read 5 pages through the book. I'm asking myself, what have I understood so far? And what is the bigger picture that this book has? So often I have seen that students with learning disabilities, they have difficulty monitoring their own progress, whether it's in reading, whether it's in writing, whether it's in math. So that's a major challenge that our students have. A similar challenge that they have is goal setting. That is another area for executive functioning or metacognition. Setting a realistic goal. So you are a classroom teacher, you gave an assignment, major assignment, which is due, say, after 2 weeks. And our students with disabilities in particular, they will think that they will start that assignment maybe 2 days ago and they will be done with. That is not the case. We need to explicitly show them how goal setting works, how do backward planning works. We need to walk them through date by date, different parts of the assignment. If it is a writing assignment, there are various stages of writing: planning, drafting, brainstorming. All of those are done before one even starts writing, and then when they have drafted, they need to edit. So all of those steps we need to show to them as a classroom teacher. Same thing for reading. We need to work with them to set those goals. And these strategies have been proven to be helpful. These metacognitive strategies, I am a huge proponent of in teaching to our students. We don't want to create learned helplessness. You often hear that term in education. We want our students to have these strategies so that they can help themselves with some support. So in the beginning, you want to provide these supports, you want to model these behaviors, you want to model these strategies, but our eventual aim is that they are proficient in using those strategies themselves. A good strategy that helps with metacognition is a checklist. Checklist is an excellent strategy, or cue cards, or some prompts. Those are some wonderful strategies that can help students with disabilities in monitoring their thoughts. So again, I'm mindful of time, so for that I will move on to classroom accommodations. So now we have moved on to, we looked at what challenges our students have. Now we will look at what can we do in general education classroom, mainstream classroom, to help these students with disabilities. And you often hear the term classroom accommodations. These are some supports, external supports that are provided to students with disabilities, and they are part of their IEPs, individualized educational program. Here in the United States, an IEP is a legal document. As a classroom teacher, if there is an accommodation that is listed on student's IEP and the classroom teacher has neglected to provide that accommodation, parents can take schools to the court. There have been numerous court cases where school districts have been brought to court and parents have won those lawsuits. I'm not sure how it works in India. Again, I have been living outside India for last 25 years. So I apologize, my lack of connection with Indian context. Maybe you can educate me. But these are the supports that students with disabilities receive when they are in general education classrooms. I will go to this slide, then I will stop for that poll that Mr. Srinivaslu was mentioning before. These are different types of accommodations. These are different kinds of supports that can be provided to students with disabilities. For example, presentation accommodation. As a classroom teacher, you know that your student, your student has difficulty, let's say they have reading difficulties, as I was mentioning before. So you give them, and if it is available in your classroom, you give them a headset, you give them a computer, and they can listen to as opposed to reading. Those of your students who have hearing difficulties, maybe when you are playing a YouTube clip, the closed captioning, that can help. For students with visual impairment, maybe large font text can be helpful. So all of those are examples of presentation accommodation. The second one is setting. Setting is about where the students receive those services. And some of my students, they responded better to instruction when I took them outside the classroom, from my inclusive classroom, which did have about 25 to 30 students, to a smaller setting. I took them to the library where it was almost one-on-one or in small groups. So some students benefit from that kind of setting. Other setting could be teacher proximity. Those of your students who have difficulty hearing, maybe you can have them sit near you or in front of the classroom. Several students with ADHD, students with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they also, it is helpful to them when they are sitting in front of the classroom and away from distraction. I would not sit them near the window or near the classroom door where they are seeing other people walking in the hallway and getting distracted. So those are the things you need to be mindful of, and those are examples of setting accommodations. Timing accommodation, this is the most commonly used accommodation in special education in inclusive classrooms. Timing is our students with especially with intellectual disabilities, they need more time to process. Something that can take general education students maybe 15 minutes to complete. Our students, they need extra time, so about 25-30 minutes. So extended time on assignments is most commonly used accommodations that you will find in inclusive classroom. Similar to timing is scheduling. This accommodation is similar to timing but little different. For example, you break up the test that you are giving in multiple sessions. Why would I do that? For students who have ADHD, for students who have emotional disturbance, right? They can't focus for a sustained amount of time, for an hour or for 45 minutes. So as a teacher, I broke the assignment up. I broke the test up in several different sessions. Maybe I gave, I allowed them to work for say 30 minutes, then I gave them 15 minutes break, and then I gave the next session. And that helps many students. I have given those kinds of scheduling accommodations to several of my students with disabilities who had emotional disturbance and ADHD. In fact, here in the US, scheduling accommodations are also provided on state level or the federal level tests. For example, in India, when I was growing up, we had board exams that was conducted by the state. These exams are separate from the exams that classroom teachers give. And even on those state level exams or board exams, students with difficulties or disabilities, they receive the scheduling accommodation. They can take that even on several days, not just on one day. You can give one test on several days depending on the student's need. And all of these accommodations are listed on their IEPs. So whatever is on their student's IEP, we provide those supports. And the last one is response accommodation. This is the accommodation which allows students to respond in a different way. For example, what I was mentioning before, as opposed to writing handwritten assignment, they can type up, or they can give their response orally, verbally. Another example of this response accommodation that I used for my students with disabilities in the classroom, when I gave them multiple choice questions, I took two options off. I deleted two wrong options. So for my students who had reading difficulties, I gave them only two options to choose from. How did it help? They had to read less, because I knew as their teacher, because my students have difficulty reading. So again, they had to find the correct answer, but instead of reading four responses, I gave them just two. And when I was distributing the test to all of my students, I had all of my tests in my hand, and I had circled those tests that I would give to my students with disabilities. My rest of the class, they did not even know that some students in the classroom, and generally about 6 to 7 students with disabilities, are placed in a general education classroom here in the United States. Class of 25 students, 6 to 7 students will have some sort of disability. That has been my experiences. So that's an example of a response accommodation. So multiple different ways, modalities, give them so that they can respond whatever their preference is in terms of responding. So I will stop here, Mr. Srinivasu, at this time, if you want to run your poll.
Yes. Good evening, Dr. Ajay sir, and this is Dr. Shilpa Manognya, and I'm sorry I had some technical glitch. I couldn't connect in the beginning of the session. However, I'm glad I could connect finally. At this point of time, I would like to announce to all the participants in the webinar that we will be starting a poll. You will see a question, and you can select the appropriate option. Curriculum is adapted to suit the learning needs of students with disability in my class or school. If you think this statement is true with respect to your current position and environment, please select from one of the options. If you think it is not applicable, you can also select not applicable. For the information of the participants, if you are not able to see the question on your screen, please click on the poll icon on your mobile screen or on your laptop, and you will see the question. Then you can see the options and submit whichever option you choose. Thank you so much. I think some of you are not able to see the question, but however, many of you have participated in the poll, and now I would be showing the results to you. You will be able to see the results on your screen now. 52% have opted for most of the times, and 35% have opted for sometimes. That indeed tells us that yes, in India we are following the curricular adaptations which you have just discussed, Dr. Ajay, in our inclusive schools, and those who have the percentage of not applicable is quite low. That's all for now, and over to you, Dr. Ajay. You can continue with your.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Manoj. Okay, so now we move to the last part of this presentation, and I will briefly be talking about some high leverage practices for inclusive education. Um, and again, as I briefly alluded before at the outset of my presentation, we want to inform our instruction with research. And in education, we have now almost 40-50 years of research that we have available. We want to utilize those practices. Just like for our health, we will only take that medicine. I'm hearing some background noise, Dr.
Just a minute,
Manoj.
sir.
ఓకే ఓకే
Shilpa madam.
అంటే ఇప్పుడు కొంచెం ట్రాన్స్మిషన్ డిలే ఉంది నా
Just a
దగ్గర
minute. Shilpa madam.
ఇది
మీరు వాయిస్ మ్యూట్లో పెట్టండి.
Can I get started, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Srinivas?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So what I was saying before is, as practitioners in the field of special education, whether you are a classroom teacher, whether you are a school psychologist, whether you are a teaching assistant, whatever your role is, whether you are an administrator, some of you may be school principals, right? And you form, you shape the teaching environment in your school, right? So we want to inform our instruction based on what research has shown. And in special education, there is a large body of research that we have accumulated in last 50 years. There is a strong body of research for instruction. There is a strong body of research for assessment. There is a large body of research in terms of working with families of students with disabilities in different areas. Just metacognition, that I was mentioning before. Research informed us that these are the practices that we should be using in the classroom for maximum benefit for students with disabilities, and those are not coming from just anecdotal evidence. When I say anecdotal evidence, is that I heard someone say that it worked, or it just worked in my classroom. If a strategy that works in your classroom, please use that. Just don't wait for research to inform you. Okay, so that should be the understanding that we should have. But again, primarily we want to see what does research say, and then inform and adapt our instruction. So one of the key body of research that comes from is universal design for learning. And I'm sure many of you who have been in this field, you probably heard of this term. In short, it is called UDL. And as the name suggests, it's universal design. And if you think of education or instruction, it's primarily comprised of three main components. Instruction, the first component is planning. As educators, that's the first thing we do, is to plan instruction for our students, right? And we need to be really mindful of the needs of our student. And the name suggests universal design. Excuse me. Is that when we are planning, at that time, I am not just planning for few students in my classroom. I'll just give you an example of my classroom when I was in high school in Ranchi, in Jharkhand. That's where I grew up. Most of my teachers, when I was in 9th and 10th grade, they would ask questions to some students, 4 or 5 students who were sitting in the front seat mostly. And when they received responses from them, they understood that all of the students in the classroom understood the concept. That is actually not the case. Those few students in the classroom, those are perhaps your high achievers, right? They are They are your general education students, your students with disabilities. They are probably not even participating in the conversation. So as a classroom teacher, as an inclusion teacher, I want to be mindful of that when I plan instruction, I am not planning just for my high achievers. And the point about those three key components of instruction, the first is planning, second is obviously the instruction or when we teach, and the last one is assessment. So all of these three, they are kind of cyclical or circular. So you plan, you teach, you assess, and then the data that you receive from assessment or the quizzes or the tests or the projects or portfolios that you get from them, they inform you how your students have learned or not learned. And then the cycle begins again based on that data that you plan your instruction, next instruction. And for that reason, those of you who are perhaps teaching in higher education, Dr. Manogna, Dr. Patnaik, and others, you know how important pre-assessment is. Pre-assessment is highly important. Before we begin our instruction, we want to know where our students are, what's the baseline. In special education, finding that baseline is critical, absolutely critical, because that informs us what strategies I can use to help my students. So finding out that baseline, and you can use informal assessment. You can even ask some questions to your students, to find that baseline, and then in special education, our purpose is to find the baseline of our students and move them along. And having taught for 11 years in K-12 classroom, I see this is how general education and special education differ. In general education, the purpose is to cover content, right? Those of you who are teaching, say math in high school, or English in high school, or social studies in middle school, whatever grade you are teaching, your purpose is to cover the content. In special education, of course, that is the case. We want to cover the content, but we want to make sure that we move the student from their baseline, wherever they are, to move them from the stage where they are at. And that is why identifying students' strengths, interests, and needs, all of those, they become critical, that we find based on that triangulation. We find that data that will inform us what their strengths are. So the key components of UDL, as you can see in the PowerPoint slide, are three. One is representation, the second one is engagement, and the last one is expression. And that aligns with the three components of teaching that I was mentioning before: planning, instruction, and assessment. So let's look at what are some things we can do at the planning level. We want to understand who are our auditory learners, who respond well to auditory instruction. That means listening. There are some students who listen well and respond well orally, right? Now, why is that important? Because those of our students who have difficulty reading, right, decoding, they have challenge. As a teacher, if you did not keep that in mind, you are, as a teacher, if you have, let's say, a large reading task in the classroom, you are excluding some students who have reading difficulties. So finding out who those learners are, and then not just using lecture, maybe providing some other ways, using some visuals that they can see. So that's those are the things you want to keep that in mind during representation phase, is to find out how are, in different ways, how can I deliver the content to my students. And don't think that technology is the only way to present information visually. Often you will think, oh, I must have a smartboard in the classroom. I must have YouTube clips in the classroom. No, there are graphic organizers or charts that you can use to show to the students that they can utilize with processing information. Second one is engagement. Think about how your students can be engaged better in instruction. There are, as I was saying before, interest inventory. That's a great tool for teachers to find out what their students are interested in. Peer collaboration, peer tutoring, or working in small groups. Some students thrive in that environment. In science classrooms, I have seen teachers having stations where students go from one station to another and work in pairs or in small groups. Use of real objects. When I was teaching math concepts, for example, a cone or a cylinder or a sphere, I gave them real objects to touch to see how they look. And the last one is movement. Your students who have ADHD, perhaps they will be that will help them with engagement. They can sit for a long period of time. And the last one is expression, the UDL component. You can allow oral responses, typed responses, projects, group presentations. So giving them a variety of options that they can show what they have learned. Again, let me see the time. I'm again running short of time. Dr. Manogna is saying on the text, I will go very quickly. Graphic organizers, these are, again, all of the strategies that I have listed, they have been informed by research, a solid body of research. And I will show you some examples of graphic organizers in next slide. For metacognition, some strategies that you can use is think aloud. So get them to talk about their thinking while they are processing information. Mnemonics, acronyms, and checklists. So these are some strategies that you can use, and these are some examples of graphic organizers that can be used, that you can use in your classroom. Again, I'm running short of time. I would have liked to go to a functional behavior assessment, but for the sake of time, I would not be able to cover. This is an excellent strategy for classroom management. So I will stop here and I will welcome your questions and have the opportunity to answer your questions. Some references. Thank you, Dr. Manogna.
Thank you, Dr. Ajay. Of course, my intention is not to stop your lecture, but indeed, we need to spend some dedicated question and answer session with our participants. So if you would like to speak maybe for a few minutes on functional assessment, it's okay with us.
Okay, all right, sure. Thank you for allowing me, Dr. Manogna. All right, so functional behavior assessment, and this is done for students who have, say, chronic behavioral challenges. Not that a student had some behavioral issues for one day and then it disappeared the next day. This is done for someone who has repeated difficulties with classroom behavior. For example, speaking out of turn. Let's just use that as an example. In the classroom, you have a student perhaps who has emotional disturbance, and he or she does not know how to raise his hand and wait for the turn to speak. Again, in my experiences, I have had many students who had these difficulties in inclusive classroom. There are 25, 30 other students in the classroom, but this student is always trying to get your attention. So functional behavior assessment, this is done to understand the purpose. The word function in this term is that gives you the connotation of understanding the function or the purpose of the behavior. we as teachers, we want to understand why is it that this student is exhibiting this type of behavior. And that behavior can be anything. For example, hitting others, snatching someone's notebook, or snatching someone's pencil. I have seen students in my classroom who pulled someone's hair or started fighting. Those kinds of behavior that we see in inclusion classroom. So we want to get to the bottom of it. Why does that happen? And there are multiple strategies to find out why they are doing that behavior. We collect data from our own observations in our classroom. We also ask other classroom teachers, other teachers in the school, is that behavior is also exhibited in their classroom, because it may happen that the student is sitting in your classroom and he or she is sitting next to someone who they don't get along well with, and for that reason they are fighting with them. But if that is happening in other classroom as well, then that kind of gives you that confirmation that those behaviors are not happening just in your classroom. Those are also happening in other classrooms. The other source of information is parents. Parents give a great deal of insight while conducting functional behavior assessment. You want to get to the parents, ask them, do you see these challenges at home as well? So collecting data from multiple sources. So we identify why they are exhibiting that behavior. But again, that is not the end, right? Our purpose is to stop that behavior, right? As a classroom teacher, you don't want to run instruction while students are talking over you, right? I mean, you are trying to teach and there are some students, they are not listening to you, right? They are constantly disruptive. So your purpose as a classroom teacher is to stop those behaviors, right? Or to minimize those behaviors, right? So for example, you completed this functional behavior assessment and you found out that the student, let's say Johnny, his name is Johnny, and he is struggling in math, and he tries to avoid that behavior, and for that reason he is disturbing his classmate so that he doesn't have to do his work. So what do? You give Johnny, as a teacher, you want to find out where Johnny's current level is. So the class is working on higher level problems and you find out where his level is and you give them easier problems, if you will, so that they feel success in those problems, right? Success in solving those problems, right? The other often the other purpose of classroom challenging behavior is attention. Often our students, they seek classroom teachers' attention, they seek their peers' attention. So while you are trying to teach, they are constantly disruptive, talking over you. What they are doing is that they want you to say, hey, someone, please stop, stop talking, right? So they want your attention. So you want to teach them appropriate ways to seek attention. You want to teach them, raising your hands and then you give them attention, or you find other ways to give them attention. For example, I often got my students to say erasing something from the whiteboard or blackboard, and they felt that they were getting attention. I often asked those of my students who were seeking attention to distribute papers to the students in the classroom, distributing calculators to other students in the classroom. So those are the ways we can give attention to the student who is craving for attention but exhibiting problem behaviors in the classroom. So again, very brief summary of functional behavior assessment. That is how it is done. There are lots and lots of details about this strategy, and again, I have not done a justice for explaining, but again, there is information out there. Please take a look and learn about functional behavior assessment strategy, and then after this we develop what is called behavior intervention plan. That is, we put that in place and support those students who have behavioral challenges.